So this video is the last of the Unit 1 videos, part 2 of eukaryotic cellular components. The first one we'll look at is the famed mitochondria, known as the powerhouse of the cell. Um, Unfortunately, it's not wrong, really. The mitochondria is the place where organic materials are broken down for cellular energy, and that cellular energy is in the form of ATP. We will talk about this when we go over cellular respiration, how the glucose molecule is broken down into several ATPs for the cell to use. One interesting thing about the mitochondria is it has its own DNA. It has its own ribosomes, as you can see from this picture. It even has a double membrane that is folded up, and these folds, which are called cristae, are there for more surface area inside the mitochondria for more work. One of the ideas behind the mitochondria is that at one time it was perhaps its own organism, because it resembles so much a prokaryotic cell, which has its own DNA and has its own ribosomes, of course. So that is one of the theories behind that. If you remember, Lynn Margulis, who came up with a theory called the endosymbiotic hypothesis, the idea of how eukaryotes came from prokaryotes through this process of one cell ingesting another cell and becoming a symbiotic relationship, eventually one organism. Another organelle that mimics the same idea is the chloroplast, which is found in plant cells. The chloroplast, again, has its own DNA, has its own ribosome, has a double membrane. Inside the chloroplast, there are also these tiny discs called thylakoids. Thylakoid is where the important process of chloroplasts happens, because chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. So inside these chloroplasts, photosynthesis is occurring, and so this is a very important structure indeed. Another structure that we'll look at is called the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton gives the cell shape and support, and there are many different types of cytoskeleton. We're going to look at 3 of them. They keep the inside of the cell organized, gives the cell motility, which is the cell moving around in its own environment, allows the cell to change shape if it needs to do that. They're composed of many different size proteins. We're going to look at 3. The first one that we'll look at are called microtubules. Microtubule are formed from proteins called tubulin proteins, and the microtubule is the largest structure in the cytoskeleton. These are basically large hollow tubes. Their main function is support and movement of the cell or individual organelles inside the cell. They make several important structures inside cells. One of them are called centrioles, which are an important part of cell division. The centrioles kind of act as anchor points during cell division. So remember, we talked about chromosomes being present in cell division. Well, these centrioles act as these anchors. So these structures, which are called spindle fibers, can take those chromosomes and pull them to opposite ends of the cell. The spindles are also made of microtubules as well, and so you can see that these microtubules are moving things around inside the cell. Well, also, they can actually move the cell itself. So here's 2 examples of microtubules that act in this way. This one's called the flagella. The sperm cell here is propelled through its environment using flagella. And here are cilia, which are tiny hair-like structures that kind of move around in order to propel this cell, which looks like some sort of paramecium or something, through its environment. The smallest type of cytoskeleton are called microfilaments. This particular example of microfilaments are made from a protein called actin. There are others, one called myosin, for instance, that is also there. These are more solid rods, whereas the microtubules were flexible structures. These are solid rod structures. They provide a pulling force inside the cell, very abundant in muscle filaments, of course. Muscles are pulling on each other in order to cause your muscle to contract, and so the actin and myosin filaments work together to do that. Here's a picture of some muscle tissue. You can see the bands of these filaments inside each of the muscle cells. And then the last of the cytoskeleton elements that we'll look at are called intermediate filaments. These can be made of different proteins. One of the primary ones that we'll look at is called keratin. Keratin, you're probably familiar, is found in hair and in fingernails and that sort of thing. The intermediate filaments are permanent solid structures, whereas the actin filaments can be broken down and built back up again. Intermediate filaments, more permanent structures, think of like the load-bearing structures in like a building, mostly composed of keratin proteins again, which can form things like hair and nails, which we know to be strong. These help to reinforce, brace large molecules inside the cell, or large structures, or even other cytoskeleton elements. Another structure that is not unique to plants, but definitely has plants have them, are called cell walls. The cell wall gives the plant cell structure, gives it protection. It is made out of cellulose in plants, but in fungi, the same structure that does the same thing is made out of chitin, which is another type of sugar. Lastly, the last structure we'll look at is called the extracellular matrix, or the ECM. The extracellular matrix is an outer protective skeleton for the cell membrane in animal cells. The word extra kind of means outside, and matrix is like a skeleton, so very similar to an outside skeleton. It also functions to communicate with other cells. You can see here how it's attached to these proteins, which are attached to the inside of the cell, and so another cell has the same sort of structures. They are able to communicate with one another.